My loving students and respected followers, you all are most welcome to my channel Grammar Corner. Okay, today we are discussing again on voice change when we get double objects in a sentence, factitive object and a reflexive object. Okay, today our discussion of course about voice change regarding some special cases when our object like number one double object. Okay, double object. Number two factitive object. Okay, and number three reflexive object. Regarding three types of objects, how we can do passive structure of the sentence, this is our topic to discuss for today. Okay, now you see, when there are double object, factitive object and reflexive object in the sentence, then how we can do our passive sentence structure from active, isn't it? This is very important to know. Now we have to know what is double object and what is the structure of the sentence of double object in case of active and passive. This is our first discussion. Okay, now you see, here you see double object. What I have written here in active structure, you see there are double object. Okay, number one object this and number one object this. Sometimes we get double objects in a sentence. Okay, and both the objects is for verb, isn't it? Nothing else. If I get double objects in a sentence, then the first object is called indirect object. Very important. When you ask your verb with whom, if you ask your verb with whom, then we get this object. And when we ask your verb with what, then we get the second object, isn't it? When we get object asking your verb by whom, very important, then this is indirect object. And when we get object asking the verb by what, then we get direct object. আমরা যখন ভার্বকে কাকে দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করব, as I told several time, যে আমাদের ভার্বকে কি বা কাকে দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করতে হবে। ওকে, অন্য কোনো কিছু দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করলে হবে না, কি বা কাকে দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করলে যেটা উত্তর আকারে বেরিয়ে আসবে সেটাই হচ্ছে that answer would be the object of the verb. তো তুমি যদি whom দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করো, কাকে দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করো, তাহলে যে বেরিয়ে আসবে তাকে আমরা indirect object বলবো. This is your indirect object. Okay, and what দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করলে যে বেরিয়ে আসবে উত্তর হিসাবে তাকে আমরা কি বলবো? Direct object, isn't it? In this way you have to get indirect and direct object. You have to know them. Why? Now you see the passive structure. This is your active structure. Now you see the passive structure. Okay, as you know, when we do passive, then what we do? Subject plus verb plus object, isn't it? We take object here, we take subject here, and here we set the passive form of the verb. In this way we generally do our passive sentence from active one, isn't it? If this is so, then there is only one object. If we have another object, then which object we have to set in the place of subject? This is the question, isn't it? So if you get two objects like this, object 1 and object 2, this is your object 1 and this is your object 2. If you get in this way two objects, then you have to know first which one is indirect object and which one is direct object, isn't it? How you can know? You just ask your verb by whom, then you get the answer, that is your indirect object, and you ask your verb with what, then you get the second object, that is your direct object. Now which object you set, which object, if you get second object, suppose if you get second object, then which one you have to set in place of subject at the time of doing passive voice, isn't it? Now you see, we are taking the indirect object first. Okay, this is object, indirect object, okay, in place of subject. Okay, now you set the passive verb. Now you set your passive verb. This is passive verb. Okay, now you set this retained object. This object is called, that you didn't take in place of the subject, that is called retained object. After placing the passive verb form, then you set the retained object. This object is called retained object, isn't it? That is direct object. You just set in its own place as retained object. Okay, then you set by, like every time, then you set subject, that is this subject. Okay, here the subject, then you get subject লিখতে হবে আমাদের objective form, as you know. This is our passive structure. Okay, now you see, this is in case if you have get double object. If you get double object, then you set the indirect object in place of subject, then you set passive verb of your verb, and then direct object you set as retained object after placing the verb, and then set you by, and then you set your subject in objective form, isn't it? In this way you can get the passive structure of the active one if you have double object problem in your active structure. Okay, now you see factitive object. This is also very important. You have to know first what is factitive object, isn't it? Factitive object is nothing but the complement of the object. This is your object, okay, and this complement is for object, objective complement. Clear? What is factitive object? Factitive object is nothing but the complement of the object. What we get after object, isn't it? That is called the factitive object. Okay, sometimes we say the complement of the object. This is called factitive object, isn't it? With example I will show you very shortly, isn't it? Now this is your active sentences structure. You see, this is your subject, this is your verb, this is your object, and this part is the complement of the object. If you get something after object, isn't it, that is mentioning, that is telling something about object, that is your factitive object. Okay, this part is your factitive object. Okay, this part is your factitive object. That means this object is bearing some fact. Okay, now you see, if this is your problem, if you get in your active sentence this like factitive object, then how you can change the sentence from active to passive, isn't it? Then you first set the object here in the place of subject, isn't it? At first you set, when you are doing passive, you have to set your object. Then you first set the object, not complement. Mind it, complement is not your object, and you cannot set the complement in the place of subject when you do passive voice. Mind it. So whenever you had object here, isn't it? Then you take the object in place of subject. Clear? In place of subject. Now you set the passive verb structure of the verb. Okay, now you set the complement in its own place. দেখো আমি কমপ্লিমেন্টটা তার নিজের জায়গায় বসিয়ে দিয়েছি। ওকে, কমপ্লিমেন্টটাকে আমি নিজের জায়গায় বসিয়ে দিয়েছি। ওকে, then you set by, then you set subject as object, as you generally do in case of passive voice, isn't it? In this way you have to do the factitive passive voice when you get the factitive object in your active sentence. Okay, now you see a reflexive object. This is another kind of object. Okay, and this is very easy to understand. This is your subject, this is your verb, and you see here you have the object. That object gets self word. When your object with self word, then it is called a reflexive object. Clear? A reflexive object. When your object is with some self word, then this is called reflexive object. This is our reflexive object, and this is your active sentence pattern. Now if you get the reflexive object, then how you can do its passive voice? Very simple. In this case, try to remember, in this case you have to set a different method when you do passive voice, isn't it? In this case, if you get a reflexive object in a sentence, then you no need to change the place of subject and object in case when you do passive voice. You set directly, you set subject in its own place. No need to take subject after by. Mind it. You set subject just its own place. Then you set the passive verb of the verb. Then you set the self object in its own place. You see, you set by, and then you set object in its own place. Here no need to take. In this case we do not follow this general method of doing passive voice. We do not do this thing here. Mind it. This thing we do not do here. What we do here, you set subject in its own place, then you make the passive verb form of the verb, then you set by, and then you set object plus self. Whatever you get as reflexive object, you set reflexive object just putting your preposition by, isn't it? In this way we have to get all this passive structure in cases of double object, factitive object, and reflexive object, isn't it? What is factitive object? I have already told you. What is reflexive object? I have already told you. What is double object? Also I have told you. In case of double object, there you have to know what is direct object, what is indirect object, how you can know, method also given there, all these things. Okay, now I am showing some example to clear the idea so far I told you, isn't it? Now you see, here you see double object. This is examples, mind it. I am clearing the idea. So far I have only told you the structure, that method, isn't it? What is the structure of active in case of 3 items I told you, and their passive structure, how you can make just the method I showed so far, isn't it? Now I am clearing, having these examples. Understand? Now you see, he has given me a book. Now you see, he, your subject, very good. Has given, this is your verb, right? Me is your object, and a book is your another object, isn't it? Me is your object, me is your object, book also is your object. There you have 2 objects. Now which one is indirect object and which was is direct object, you have to know. Clear? Now what I told you, if you ask your verb with whom, then you get indirect object, and when you ask your verb with what, then you get as answer your direct object. এখানে আমি যদি has given দিয়েছে, কি দিয়েছে, এ বুক, কি দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করলে যে উত্তর সেটা ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট, কাকে দিয়েছে হুম, ঠিক আছে, কাকে দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করলে যেটা বেরোবে সেটা ইনডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট। নাও ইউ হ্যাভ গট অল দিস থিং, ইনডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট, ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট, ইজন্ট ইট? অ্যান্ড ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্টকে রিটেন্ড অবজেক্টও বলা হয়। ইন মাই just finished page, I told that direct object is retained object because this object is retained in its own place, okay, in general case. Now you see the passive structure, as I already showed you how to make this passive voice of this active one when your object is double, like this, me and a book, okay. Now you see he has given me a book. Clear? Now what I told you, take indirect object as subject, generally what we do in case of when we do passive voice. We take object. Which object we have to take? We have two objects here, okay. Generally this is better if we take the indirect object first as your subject, isn't it? You can take your direct object too, but if you take direct object, okay, I will show what would be there if we take direct object as our subject in case of passive voice, okay. Let me take the indirect object as subject, that means I, okay. If I take me as subject, then I should write I, isn't it? নাও আয়ের সাথে কি হচ্ছে, হি এর সাথে হ্যাজ ছিল, আয়ের সাথে কি হয়ে যাবে, হ্যাড। নেক্সট বিন, দিস ইজ ইয়োর প্যাসিভ স্ট্রাকচার অফ ইয়োর প্রেজেন্ট পারফেক্ট, ইজন্ট ইট? প্যাসিভ স্ট্রাকচার আই এম জাস্ট পুটিং হিয়ার, আই হ্যাভ বিন, নাও ভার্বের থার্ড ফর্ম গিভেন। ক্লিয়ার? দিস ইজ ইয়োর ভার্ব থার্ড, আই হ্যাভ বিন গিভেন, আমাকে দেওয়া হয়েছে। এবার তুমি ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্টকে রিটেন্ড অবজেক্ট তার নিজের জায়গায় বসিয়ে দাও, এ বুক, ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্টকে নিজের জায়গায় বসিয়ে দাও, রিটেন্ড অবজেক্টকে রেখে দিলা। ক্লিয়ার ব্যাপারটা? তাহলে আই হ্যাভ বিন গিভেন আ বুক, এইবার বলো বাই হিটাকে নিয়ে চলে আসো, হিটাকে নিয়ে চলে আসো বাই হিম, অবজেক্টিভ ফর্মে। ক্লিয়ার? ইউ ক্যান টেক your direct object in place of subject too. If I do, then what I should write? A book, a book. This is your direct object. Any object you can take, but if you take direct object, then what would be the sentence pattern you just follow, isn't it? A book. Now third person singular, then you have to set has. In case when subject was I, then I set have. Now a book, third person singular, then has. Again passive structure been, then verb third form given. All this structure I have already shown in my previous classes. As per tense, what would be the passive structure? All are there. Just you learn from all these previous classes, okay. A book has been given, এইবার দেখো টু মি, তার মানে এই মিটাকে আমি কোথায় নিয়ে আসলাম, এইখানে নিয়ে আসলাম, আর এ বুককে এখানে নিয়ে আসলাম, কিন্তু মি এর আগে আমাকে একটা কি বসাতে হলো, প্রিপোজিশন বসাতে হলো, প্রিপোজিশন। ক্লিয়ার? সো if you take direct object, then sometime a preposition can be required, like this, isn't it? So just to avoid this type of extra thing that I have to get from outside, better if you take indirect object, that is me, I. Indirect object, if you take in place of subject, then it is easier, isn't it? But if you wish to set your direct object in place of subject, you can do, no problem. But sometimes in your sentence, as per the meaning of the sentence, sometimes preposition, particular preposition can be required. Just to avoid that thing, to get extra parts of speech from outside, better to use indirect object, isn't it, as your subject. Now I am taking another example. She gifted her sister a storybook. Okay, her sister, this is your indirect object. কাকে দিয়েছে? সে দিয়েছে তার বোনকে। কাকে দিয়েছে? কাকে দিয়ে যে উত্তরটা বেরোলো সেটা ইনডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট। কি দিয়েছে? কি এর উত্তরটা কি হয়েছে? ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট, as I told you. Now you are doing the passive voice of this active sentence. How you can do it? Isn't it? How you can do it? Just you see, this is your active sentence. She gifted her sister a storybook, isn't it? Now I have told you, you take your indirect object as your subject. Okay? Then I am writing her sister. Her sister. This is your indirect object. I have already placed in place of subject, isn't it, as we do in case of passive voice. Now you see, this is your V2, and you know the passive structure of V2 was where verb third form. তাহলে her sister, this is third person singular, তাহলে was. If it is plural, then you have to set here where. তাহলে her sister was. Okay, now gifted third কি আছে? থার্ড ফর্ম গিফটেডই হবে, তাই না? Her sister was gifted. Clear? This is your passive voice verb structure. If you get V2, that means if you get V2, that is simple past, then your passive form was oblique were plus V3. Okay, this is I have already done in my previous classes. You got all this thing from there. Now see, her sister was gifted. Clear? এবার তুমি যেটা রিটেন অবজেক্ট, আমি বলছি ডাইরেক্ট অবজেক্ট, রিটেন অবজেক্ট, ওটা হচ্ছে রেখে দেওয়ার অবজেক্ট, ওটা ওর জায়গায় বসিয়ে দাও। স্টোরি বুক, স্টোরি বুক। ক্লিয়ার? এবার বলো কার দ্বারা? বাই, ভেরি সিম্পল, বাই হার। সেটা অবজেক্টিভ ফর্মে সাবজেক্ট এখানে সেট হয়ে যাবে। তাহলে হার সিস্টার ওয়াজ গিফটেড আ স্টোরি বুক বাই হার, তার বোনকে একটা গল্পের বই দেওয়া হয়েছিল তার দ্বারা। ক্লিয়ার? নাও ইউ থিঙ্ক হিয়ার উই গেট factitive object. This is very important to know. Clear? You see, this is your object, this is your verb, right? This is your subject, okay? And this is your object. Him. People made him. লোকেরা বানিয়েছিল তাকে। এবার দেখো কি বানিয়েছিল? হিমকে, হিমটা কিন্তু এখানটায় এসে কমপ্লিট হয়নি। হিমকে কি বানানো হয়েছিল? প্রেসিডেন্ট বানানো হয়েছিল। তাহলে এই প্রেসিডেন্টটা কার জিনিস? হিমের জিনিস। খেয়াল রাখবে কিন্তু এখানটাও তুমি যদি প্রশ্ন করো, ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট টু আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড, তুমি যদি প্রশ্ন করো পিপল মেড, লোকেরা বানিয়েছিল কাকে, তাহলে হিমকে তুমি এখানে কি হিসাবে পাচ্ছ? হুম দিয়ে যদি প্রশ্ন করো তাহলে তুমি এখানে হিমকে পাচ্ছ। ক্লিয়ার? ভেরি গুড। আচ্ছা, তাহলে লোকেরা বানিয়েছিল তাকে, কি বানিয়েছিল যদি প্রশ্ন করো, কি দিয়ে যদি আমি ভার্বকে প্রশ্ন করি, হোয়াট দিয়ে যদি আমি ভার্বকে প্রশ্ন করি, তাহলে আমি কি পাবো? প্রেসিডেন্ট হওয়া উচিত। কিন্তু ইন দিস কেস your this formula will not be applied. Why? আসলে এই প্রেসিডেন্টটা আগেরটা আমার কি ছিল? she gives me a book. খেয়াল করো জিনিসটা, ডিফারেন্সটা বুঝে নাও, ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট। এটা আমার V1, এটা একটা অবজেক্ট, এটা একটা অবজেক্ট, এটাকে আমি অবজেক্টই বলছি। আর এই প্রেসিডেন্টকে কিন্তু আমি অবজেক্ট বলছি না, এটাকে কমপ্লিমেন্ট বলছি। কমপ্লিমেন্ট আর অবজেক্টের মধ্যে পার্থক্য আছে। দেখো এই দুটো জিনিস কিন্তু ডিফারেন্ট থিং। মি একজন, বই একজন। আমি যদি গিফটকে প্রশ্ন করি কাকে দেয়, তাহলে মি বেরিয়ে আসবে, আমাকে দেয়। এটা একটা অবজেক্ট, ডিফারেন্ট। কি দেয়? বুক, এটাও কিন্তু একটা ডিফারেন্ট অবজেক্ট, ঠিক আছে? সো দে আর ডিফারেন্ট অবজেক্ট। এইখানে দেখো হিম, এই প্রেসিডেন্টটা হিমেরই জিনিস। হিমকে বানানো হয়েছে প্রেসিডেন্ট, হিম আর প্রেসিডেন্ট একজন। এখানে মি আর বুক একজন নয়, হিমটাই প্রেসিডেন্ট, তাহলে এখানে একজন। তাহলে এই প্রেসিডেন্টটা মেড ভার্বের কিন্তু অবজেক্ট নয়। প্রেসিডেন্টটা হচ্ছে হিমকে কমপ্লিট করবার জন্য কমপ্লিমেন্ট আসছে। So president is complement. Okay, now I have showed you in this case any object, direct object or indirect object, any object you can set in place of subject when you go to voice change to get passive voice, isn't it? But in this case, as you know, complement never be object, so you never take complement in place of your subject. So you always have to set your object, not complement, when you get such type of factitive object, isn't it? Now you take him here in place of subject when you do passive voice, isn't it? তাহলে হিমকে আমি কি করলাম? আমি সাবজেক্ট করে বসিয়ে দিলাম হিম। হিমের সাবজেক্টিভ ফর্মটা কি আছে? হি। নাও এখানে আছে মেড, তাহলে হি ওয়াজ মেড। ক্লিয়ার? প্যাসিভ ভার্ব ফর্ম অফ মেড, হি ওয়াজ মেড। এবার তুমি কমপ্লিমেন্টটা নিজের জায়গায় বসিয়ে দাও, প্রেসিডেন্ট, প্রেসিডেন্ট। ক্লিয়ার? এবার বলে দাও কার দ্বারা? বাই পিপল। ভেরি সিম্পল। ক্লিয়ার? হি ওয়াজ মেড প্রেসিডেন্ট বাই পিপল। কিন্তু তুমি কখনোই প্রেসিডেন্টকে এখানে এনে কিন্তু বসাতে পারবে না, বিকজ দিস ইজ ইয়োর কমপ্লিমেন্ট। হিয়ার when we get double object, the difference between double object and factitive object is that in case of double object, they are both object, they are different item and they are both object. But in case of factitive object, him and president, whatever you are getting here, they are not different thing. And him is object, but president হচ্ছে হিমেরই পার্ট, হিমকে কমপ্লিট করতে আসছে। দিস ইজ ইউর কমপ্লিমেন্ট। সো ইউ ক্যানট সেট কমপ্লিমেন্ট ইন দ্য প্লেস অফ ইউর সাবজেক্ট, ইজন্ট ইট? সো এখানটায় আমি যদি বসিয়ে দিই তাহলে কি অর্থ দাঁড়াবে সেটা দেখো, তাহলে ক্লিয়ার হয়ে যাবে। দেখো আমরা যদি একে বসিয়ে দেই, প্রেসিডেন্ট ওয়াজ মেড, হিমকে যদি হিমের জায়গায় রাখি বাই পিপল, তাহলে কি কোনো অর্থ পাচ্ছ? ইউ আর গেটিং এনি মিনিং অফ দিস সেন্টেন্স? প্রেসিডেন্ট ওয়াজ মেড হিম বাই পিপল। সো দিস টাইপ অফ structure you cannot use when you get factitive object. Here, what is difference between factitive object and double object? In case of double object, any object you can set, direct or indirect object you can set in place of subject when you go to do voice change. But in case of factitive object, you cannot do this thing. You have to take your object, not complement. Complement is not object, isn't it? Now here we are getting another example. You see, this is your active structure. We considered our school the best, isn't it? This is your object clearly written here. This is your V2 and this is your subject, right? Now our school the best, তাহলে স্কুলটাই বেস্ট, they are not different item, isn't it? So this is your complement, isn't it? Now our school is object you take here in place of subject, our school. Okay, our school, this is your now subject. isn't it? Now you V2 considered, তাহলে was considered, our school was considered। এবার কমপ্লিমেন্ট তার নিজের জায়গায় বসিয়ে দাও, the best, our school was considered the best by, এবার উইকে তুমি অবজেক্ট করে নিয়ে আসো by us। ক্লিয়ার? ভেরি সিম্পল থিং, জাস্ট টু গো থ্রু হোয়াট আই এম টেলিং, আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড? নাও ইউ সি a reflexive object. To know reflexive object is very simple. When your object gets self word, okay, when you get self word with your object, this is your reflexive object, okay. Now you see he hurt himself, this is very important, this is structure, okay, as I already showed in my early page, isn't it? In this case you don't set in this way, you don't set in this way, you don't set in this way, you directly set, you place he this, okay. You have to set your subject in its own place, that is he. In case your object is a reflexive object like having self word, then you have to set your subject in its own place when you go to do passive voice, okay, and you set your verb in its own place, just making it its passive structure, passive verb। তাহলে এই হার্ট এখানে কি ফর্মে আছে? প্রেজেন্টে আছে, পাস্টে আছে? আমরা কি জানি? HURT হার্ট, HURT heart, HURT heart. This is your V1, this is your V2, this is your V3. This verb cannot change, this verb does not change its structure according to tense, heart, no problem. If it is present tense, then subject is he, তাহলে আমার হার্টের সাথে কি থাকতো? এস থাকতো। তাহলে এখানে হার্ট আছে, তার মানে এটা কি ফর্মে আছে? দিস ফর্মে আছে, V2 ফর্মে আছে। V3 ফর্মে নেই কেন? V3 ফর্মে থাকতে গেলে এর আগে এই পয়েন্টে আমাদের হ্যাজ, হ্যাড, হ্যাভ থাকতে হতো। এখানে যদি হ্যাজ, হ্যাড এগুলো থাকতো তাহলে আমরা বলতাম এটা V3 ফর্মে আছে। কিন্তু আর এটা প্রেজেন্টে আছে কিনা? তাহলে প্রেজেন্টে থাকলে হি আছে, থার্ড পারসন সিঙ্গুলার, হার্টের সাথে কি থাকতো? এস থাকতো। তাহলে এটা আমার V2 ফর্মে আছে। When we get this type of verb, heart, put, okay, short, in this case you have to know first verb is I mean its tense you have to know, isn't it? How you can know? If it is present, then you see whether there is s after verb, or you have to know the sentence, isn't it? You have to know the tense of the verb. In other case, we just seeing the verb pattern, we can say this is present form, this is past form, like go, went, okay, gone. We can easily know this is your V1, this is your V2, and this is your V3. But in this case, okay, we cannot easily understand in which form this verb is set in your sentence, isn't it? Now you see heart your V2, then he was hurt, this is your V3, as I have already showed here. তাহলে he was hurt by himself, okay, he was hurt by himself. You set subject in its own place, you just change from active verb to passive verb, isn't it? Then you set by as you do in case of passive voice, and you set your object in its own place, isn't it? I suppose you have understood. Now here they killed themselves, Okay, and now what you do, you set your subject in its own place. They, now you change your verb from active pattern to passive pattern. Killed আছে v2, where এটা plural আছে তাহলে was না হয়ে where হবে. Then you set the v3 form, killed, this is your v3, তাহলে they were killed, again by you set, and you set your object in its own place by themselves. Clear? Very simple. When object is plural, in case of reflexive object, then your spelling you see him singular ACLF, them plural, এটা কি হয়ে যাবে, ACLF টা কি হয়ে যাবে, ACLF থাকলে কি হয়, VES, ঠিক আছে, themselves. Now you see I suppose you have understood all this thing very clearly. If you have any question, you must put in the comment box. I am there to give you answer. Okay? And I can't know actually how my all classes helping you. If you are getting help, then it's your duty to help the channel to grow, so that many other students like you can also get help and enhance their knowledge in English with the help of my all classes. Isn't it? Thank you so much. Have a good day.